There is a kind of silence that descends over a life when someone who was supposed to stay forever decides to leave. It is not the silence of peace. It is not the silence of rest. It is the silence of a house that still holds the shape of two people but only has one person walking through it. The coffee table still sits where they moved it together on a Sunday afternoon years ago. The photographs still line the hallway in the sequence she arranged them. The bed is still the same bed, but everything is different. And if you have ever loved someone for decades, if you have ever built an entire world around one person and called it home, then you already know exactly the kind of silence I am talking about. Now imagine that this silence is not the end of your story. Imagine that after 57 years of marriage, after raising children and surviving financial storms, and standing beside a man through every version of himself he ever decided to become, you look at a legal document and understand, clearly and completely, that you are going to fight. Not because you are angry, though you have every right to be. Not because you want revenge, though some people would call what followed exactly that. But because you spent nearly 6 decades building something real, and you are not about to let a man with a new skyscraper and a new girlfriend pretend that none of it ever happened. This is the story of Catherine and Richard Calloway. And before we go any further, I need you to understand one thing. By the time this is over, you will not just be stunned by what he did. You will be stunned by what she became. The story you are about to hear is not a tabloid story. It is not a gossip column. It is not simply about two wealthy people arguing over money in a New York courtroom, though it does involve all of that. It is a story about what happens when a man spends half a century building an empire and then, at the very moment that empire reaches its peak, decides that the woman who stood beside him through every single year of the building was not worth keeping. It is a story about what a woman does when the person she trusted most in the world proves, in the most public and humiliating way possible, that he never saw her value until she took it back. And it is a story about how the ending that Richard Calloway wrote for himself turned out to be nothing like the story he thought he was starting. There are a few questions I want you to hold in your mind as this story unfolds, because they are the questions that will make everything that follows make sense. First, how does a man hide a mistress in his own building, just blocks from where his wife of 57 years is sleeping, and convince himself that no one will ever find out? Second, when Catherine discovered the truth and filed for divorce, Richard offered her $1 billion to walk away. $1 billion. She said no. Why? What did she know that made $1 billion feel like an insult? And third, and this is the one that will stay with you the longest, after the divorce was finalized, after the skyscraper went up with his new girlfriend's face plastered on the side of it for all of New York City to see, after the art collection was auctioned off, and the legal bills piled up, and the new life Richard had chosen began to fall apart piece by piece. What happened to him? What does it look like when a man who had everything throws it all away and then has to keep living inside the consequences? We are going to answer every single one of those questions. And I promise you, the answers are more complicated and more human than you expect. To understand this story, you have to understand where both of these people came from, because where you come from shapes everything about what you do when the stakes get high. Richard Calloway was born in 1937 to a modest family in Westchester County, New York. His father worked in the garment industry, which in those years meant long hours and uncertain pay, the kind of life that teaches a child very early that stability is not something you inherit, it is something you build. Richard was sharp, restless, curious in the specific way of people who look at the world and see not what is there, but what could be there. He attended several schools, including the University of Alabama and New York University, but he never finished a degree. What he had instead of a diploma was something that certain people carry in their bones, an instinctive understanding of value, of how to see a piece of land or a building and understand what it could become if someone were willing to bet on it. He dropped out of school in 1960 and became a real estate broker at the age of 22. And if you know anything about New York real estate in the 1960s, you know that the city was at a crossroads. Manhattan was simultaneously a place of great wealth and enormous neglect, full of properties that had been overlooked, undervalued, and waiting for someone with the nerve to take a chance on them. Richard had that nerve in abundance. He transitioned quickly from broker to builder, and within a few years he had founded what would become Callaway Properties, the firm that would define the next 50 years of his professional life. What made him remarkable was not just ambition. New York has never been short of ambitious people. What made him remarkable was taste. He was genuinely passionate about architecture, about the relationship between a building and the city around it, about what it meant to put something up that would be looked at for 100 years. That combination of nerve and taste and relentless forward motion made him one of the most significant real estate developers of his generation. But it also made him the kind of man who, once he had decided he wanted something, found it very hard to accept that certain things were not his to take. Now let's talk about Catherine, because any honest account of this story has to start with who she actually was, not who she was assumed to be by the people around her, including her husband. Catherine came from a different world than Richard, not a poorer one, but a quieter one. She was the daughter of a doctor, a young woman with a fine education and a position at a publishing house in Manhattan when she and Richard first crossed paths in the late 1950s. She was, by the accounts of people who knew her in those years, someone who was both warm and precise, a combination that is rarer than it sounds. She had strong opinions about art and literature. She cared deeply about the cultural life of the city she lived in. She was not someone who made a lot of noise, but she was someone who, when she spoke, made people stop and listen. These are qualities that the world does not always recognize in real time. The people who have them often go underestimated for years, sometimes decades, before the world catches up to what they are worth. And Catherine spent a great deal of her long marriage being underestimated, including, and this is the part of the story that matters most, by the man she married. Richard and Catherine married in January of 1963, in a ceremony that by the standards of the time was elegant and understated. They were both young. They were both at the beginning of everything. And there is something almost unbearable about looking at the photographs from that day, knowing what the next 57 years are going to hold. Knowing all the ways that the two people in those photographs are about to be tested by ambition and money and time, and the particular kind of pressure that real greatness puts on ordinary human relationships. They moved into a small apartment in Brooklyn where Richard had begun to study the way his landlord managed the building and the surrounding properties, watching, learning, calculating. They were, in those early years, a team. They were building something together, even if only one of their names would ever appear on the buildings. As Callaway Properties began to grow, the life that Catherine and Richard built together grew with it. They had 2 children. They moved from Brooklyn to Manhattan, first to a modest apartment, and then, as the money came in, to something significantly grander. They became part of New York's social world, charity galas, art openings, the kind of dinner parties where guests argue about architecture and politics and the meaning of beauty laid into the night. Catherine became not just a presence in this world, but a force in it. She developed what would become one of the most significant private art collections in New York City, spending decades carefully acquiring works by artists who were not yet household names, painters and sculptors whose place in the canon of 20th century art would later be considered secure and whose market values would grow into the hundreds of millions. This was not Richard's collection. This was Catherine's. She was the one who went to the galleries, who developed the relationships with the dealers and the curators and the artists themselves, who understood the work in the way that only someone who genuinely loves art can understand it. She was not decorating a home. She was building a legacy, and she was doing it at the same time that Richard was building his, in the same city, with the same commitment and seriousness, simply without the public credit. And Richard, during all of this, was doing what Richard did. He was building and acquiring and taking risks that made other developers pale, and then watching those risks pay off in ways that cemented his legend in the New York real estate world. In 2003, he purchased the General Motors building in Midtown Manhattan for a record $1.4 billion, and then persuaded a major technology company to build a subterranean retail store beneath its iconic plaza. The value of that building doubled within a few years. It was exactly the kind of move that defined his career, seeing what other people could not see, betting on it, and being right. But it was also a move that required a particular kind of support structure, a home that was stable and organized and functioning, a partner who could absorb the stress and the chaos and the risk-taking and keep everything else running while the man she was married to was out on the edge. That partner was Catherine. That had always been Catherine. And Richard, over the course of 50 years, had made the mistake that certain kinds of driven men make. He had come to confuse the foundation for granted. He had come to see Catherine not as the person who made the whole structure possible, but as simply the structure itself, part of the background, part of the furniture. And when the biggest deal of his career finally came together, when the building that he believed would be the crowning achievement of everything he had worked for finally reached completion, he looked at the life he had built and decided he wanted a different one. Before we go deeper into how that decision was made and what it cost everyone involved, we want to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The building that Richard Callaway believed would define his legacy was unlike anything New York had ever seen. He wanted to build the tallest residential skyscraper in the Western Hemisphere, a tower so slender and so tall that it would rewrite what was architecturally possible in one of the most competitive real estate markets on the planet. The building would contain luxury condominiums so expensive, some units listed at over $90 million, that only the uppermost tier of the world's wealthy could afford them. The projected total sales value of the building was over $3 billion. Richard's anticipated share of the profits was, by his own testimony, expected to be around $400 million. The building was his obsession and his identity and the answer to every person who had ever doubted him, including himself, especially himself, during the dark years after the 2008 financial crisis, when he had lost most of his portfolio and had to start again from near zero at the age of 71. The man had rebuilt himself once. Now he was building the proof of that rebuilding in glass and steel, and it was going to be the tallest thing he had ever done, in every sense of the word. Now let us talk about Nicole Beaumont, because any honest account of this story has to reckon with who she was, not as a symbol, not as a shorthand for something convenient, but as a real person who made real choices. Nicole was in her early 60s when she and Richard became involved. She was sophisticated and well-traveled and connected to the art and philanthropic worlds that Richard and Catherine moved in, which is, of course, exactly how they met. She had been moving in the same overlapping social circles as the Callaways for years. She knew who Catherine was. She had been at some of the same functions, in some of the same rooms, had possibly even exchanged polite words at the kinds of events where the wealthy of New York gathered to support the institutions they believed defined civilized life. And when the relationship between her and Richard crossed the line from social acquaintance into something else, Richard Calloway handled it with a particular kind of arrogance that would, in the end, prove to be his most expensive mistake. He hid her in his own building. That is not a metaphor. Richard Calloway was developing and managing a property on Park Avenue, a building owned by Calloway Properties, and he arranged for Nicole to live in an apartment in that building. An apartment in a building he owned, just blocks from the home he shared with Catherine. The residents of that building knew who Nicole was. They knew she was Richard's girlfriend. For 2 years, she had been coming and going from that apartment with the casual ease of someone who has been promised that her situation is secure. For 2 years, Richard maintained this arrangement while continuing to share a home with his wife of over 50 years. He attended the same charity
I was
dinners
thinking
and
about
the
our trip
same
to
social
Paris next
events
spring.
and
The
continued
city
to be
lights are so
photographed
beautiful at night.
alongside Catherine
yes.
in the way that New York couples of their stature are photographed, presenting the public face of a long and distinguished marriage, while just a few blocks away the other story was unfolding in real time. It is worth pausing here to consider what this arrangement required of Richard, because I think it tells you something essential about who he was in those years. It required a sustained willingness to look at Catherine, the woman he had been with since the early 1960s, the mother of his children, the keeper of a home and a social world, and an art collection that had made his life richer in every measurable way, and lie. Not once. Not in a moment of weakness or confusion. Every single day, for 2 years, by what he said and what he chose not to say, he was choosing deception. People who maintain this kind of arrangement for extended periods of time tend to construct elaborate internal justifications for it. The marriage was already over in every meaningful sense. She knows something is wrong and has chosen not to address it. We have simply grown apart after many decades, and this new relationship is what should have existed all along. These justifications are common. They are also, in almost every case I have ever encountered in stories like this one, eventually revealed to be exactly what they are. Stories a person tells themselves because the truth, which is simply that they are hurting someone who does not deserve to be hurt, is not a story they are willing to sit with. What Richard did not appear to fully reckon with was Catherine herself. He had spent 50 years with her. He knew her better than almost anyone on earth. And yet in the planning and execution of this new chapter he had decided to write for himself, he made a fundamental error of assessment. He underestimated her. He had spent so long seeing her as the background of his life, as the stable, competent, socially graceful woman who ran the household and cultivated the art collection and smiled at the right people at the right dinners, that he had stopped seeing her as someone with power. Someone with knowledge. Someone who had access, through decades of deep financial and social embeddedness in his life, to information that he could not afford to have used against him. Catherine knew where everything was. She had been paying attention for 50 years. And when she found out, when the arrangement that was supposed to be invisible became visible, she did not fall apart. She got quiet. And when Catherine got quiet, that was when you needed to worry. The exact moment when Catherine Calloway learned about Nicole in the apartment on Park Avenue is not part of the public record in the way that some details of this story are. What is part of the public record is that by 2016, Richard
This
had
is
stopped
perfect,
being
isn't it?
discreet at all.
Absolutely. I feel
He had
so at
begun
ease.
appearing
Me
with
too.
Nicole openly in the Hamptons, not quietly, not cautiously, but visibly. In the way of a man who has decided the secret is effectively over and the transition from one life to another is simply a matter of logistics now. He told friends. He told colleagues. He appeared in social settings with Nicole in ways that made it clear to everyone in his and Catherine's shared world exactly what was happening. And then, apparently satisfied that the message had been fully received, he told Catherine, after 57 years of marriage, at the age of 78, because he had built the tallest residential skyscraper in the Western Hemisphere and decided he deserved a new life to go alongside it. Catherine filed for divorce, and the moment she did, a war began that would consume years of both their lives and hundreds of millions of dollars in legal fees, asset valuations, depositions, and courtroom testimony that the New York legal world is still talking about. The two sides could not agree on the value of a single significant asset. The spectacular Plaza apartment they had purchased for $60 million and then spent another $30 million renovating was worth $55 million according to Catherine's legal team and $107 million according to Richard's. The art collection that Catherine had spent decades building was worth $625 million according to her appraiser and $788 million according to his. Christie's had valued it at $937 million in 2015. The gap between the two sides was not a clerical disagreement. It was a declaration of intent. Richard Calloway intended to fight for every dollar, and Catherine Calloway intended to make sure he paid for every year. What made this divorce trial unlike almost any other in recent memory was not just the scale of the assets, though that scale was staggering. It was the testimony. Richard Calloway, the man who had built a $2 billion empire through sheer force of will, took the stand in a Manhattan courtroom and made a claim so audacious that it is still discussed in legal circles today. He claimed to be broke. He said that his expected profits from the crown jewel of his career, the skyscraper, had come in $350 million below his projections. He said that his share of the profits, which he had once expected to be around $400 million, had been reduced to approximately $48 million. He said this under oath, with his wife of 57 years sitting across the room. And the judge, a woman named Laura Drager who had been on the bench long enough to have heard everything, looked at the numbers and began asking questions that Richard Calloway had not fully prepared himself to answer. Here is what $1 billion looks like when it is used as an insult. When Catherine's attorneys began building their case and the full picture of the marital assets started to emerge, Richard came forward with an offer. He would give Catherine $1 billion to settle and walk away. $1 billion, a number so large it is almost impossible to process as a real figure, a number that would have secured the financial futures of Catherine and her entire family for generations. And Catherine looked at that offer and said no. Not after lengthy deliberation. Not with visible hesitation. No, because Catherine had spent 57 years watching this man build a fortune, and she knew with the precision of someone who had been paying attention even when no one was asking her to that $1 billion was not what she was owed. It was what he was hoping she would settle for. Her refusal changed everything. When a woman who has been offered $1 billion says no, the world pays attention. The message that refusal sent to Richard and to the court was unmistakable. Catherine Calloway did not believe that Richard was being honest about what he had, and she had the knowledge and the documentation to support that belief, because she had been inside the financial architecture of their shared life for more than 5 decades. The divorce trial that followed became one of the most scrutinized in New York's history. Not because wealthy people arguing about money is unusual, it is not, but because of what the testimony revealed about the internal workings of one of the city's most storied real estate empires. The couple had no prenuptial agreement. New York is an equitable distribution state, which means that the court considers the contributions both parties made to the marriage when dividing assets. and Catherine Calloway had made contributions that the legal record could not ignore. The trial lasted 14 weeks. It included testimony across 17 separate court days over the span of several months. Judge Drager heard from financial experts, real estate appraisers, art valuators, and from Richard and Catherine themselves. What emerged from those weeks of testimony was a portrait of a marriage that was far more complicated than the public version had ever suggested. A marriage in which both parties had sometimes said terrible things to each other, sometimes driven each other to a kind of frustrated desperation that long marriages are entirely capable of producing. Richard's attorneys tried to argue that Catherine's contributions to the Calloway fortune were less significant than she claimed. Catherine's attorneys presented 57 years of evidence that she had contributed more than anyone had ever properly acknowledged. And then Richard Calloway, during his own testimony, said something that, according to people in the courtroom, produced a visible and sustained reaction from Catherine and from the judge. He was discussing a loan Catherine had made him from her own personal savings, at a 15% interest rate, to close on a property acquisition. When asked to characterize the source of that loan, Richard said, "She lent me my money. She lent me my money. Not our money. Not the money she had access to because they had been partners in a 57-year marriage. His money." And in those 4 words, Richard Calloway had said out loud what had apparently been his operating belief for years, that Catherine's contributions to their shared life were services rendered rather than partnership established, that the money was always his, that the empire was always his, that she had been, for 57 years, a supporting character in his story rather than a co-author of it. Judge Laura Drager wrote 64 pages in response to that worldview. She did not accept it. Her ruling was meticulous and precise, going through each of the Calloway properties and determining with exacting detail what each was worth and what Catherine was owed. Richard's total real estate stake across all active projects was valued at $82 million, and Catherine was awarded half. The Plaza apartment, the one they had purchased for $60 million and spent another $30 million renovating, would go to Catherine. The art collection, the one she had spent decades building, that contained more than 60 works by artists whose place in the 20th century canon is now beyond question, would be sold at auction and the proceeds divided. The judge took into account the duration of the marriage, the specific contributions of both parties, and the particular circumstances under which the fortune had been built. She did not accept the framing that Catherine had been essentially a well-compensated resident of Richard's financial life. She saw what 57 years of evidence actually showed, that these 2 people had built something together, and the law required that truth to be honored even when the man who had benefited most from the partnership had decided he no longer wished to acknowledge it. The court-ordered sale of the Calloway art collection is one of the most significant moments in this entire story, and it deserves to be understood for what it actually was. This collection had been assembled over decades, piece by piece, at Catherine's direction and through her relationships and her taste and her vision. It contained works by Rothko, Giacometti, Twombly, Warhol, Picasso, Koons, artists whose work Catherine had recognized and acquired before they commanded the prices they command today. The collection was not just financially valuable. It was a work in itself, a record of one woman's eye and her decades of serious engagement with the art of her time. When the auction house that handled the sale called it the most valuable single-owner collection to come to market in years, they were, without knowing it, writing Catherine's biography in the language of the market. The collection sold for hundreds of millions of dollars and exceeded even the most optimistic estimates. Art world observers wrote about the individual pieces with the reverence reserved for important cultural losses. And buried in every one of those assessments of market values and bidding records was the story of the woman who had spent 50 years recognizing what was important before the rest of the world caught up. Catherine Calloway had not simply preserved wealth in that collection. She had created it. And now, because her husband had decided he wanted a new life, it was being sold to strangers in a grand auction room while she watched. Now here is where the story takes the turn that I want you to stay with, because what happened next contains its own particular kind of reckoning. After the divorce was finalized, after the settlement was reached and the assets were divided and the legal machinery had finally, exhaustingly ground to a halt, Richard Calloway did something that, even in a story full of extraordinary choices, stands as one of the most audacious things a recently divorced man has ever done. He remarried Nicole Beaumont, and then he had a massive black and white portrait of the two of them, 42 feet by 24 feet, unmistakable from blocks away, mounted on the exterior of 432 Park Avenue, the skyscraper at the center of his divorce proceedings. The same building whose projected profits he had characterized as catastrophically below expectations while sitting under oath across from his wife of 57 years. He hung their portrait on it like a flag. He told a reporter that since he was not getting married in the Hamptons, he could not hire an airplane with a banner, and so he thought, I own a building. Why not hang a banner from my own building? He added that he loved the picture of himself. All of New York saw that portrait. The people who had attended Catherine's charity events and admired the art she had collected and served alongside her on the boards of cultural institutions she had given decades to, they saw it. The judges and lawyers and expert witnesses who had spent months sorting through the Calloway finances, they saw it. The couple's children and grandchildren saw it. And Catherine Calloway, living in the Plaza apartment she had fought to keep, saw it. What went through her mind at that moment is something only she knows. But the people who knew her well in those months describe a woman who had arrived at a particular kind of clarity. Not bitterness, not grief, but clarity. She had done the work. She had survived the trial and the depositions and the asset disputes and the auction. And a man putting his photograph on a building could not take any of that away from her. It was theater. Expensive, tasteless theater. But nothing more. Here is where the story delivers what certain people might be tempted to call justice, though I prefer the less satisfying and more accurate word, consequence. The skyscraper that Richard had staked his legacy on, the building whose profits had been so central to the divorce proceedings, began to generate headlines of a very different kind. A lawsuit filed by the condominium board alleged significant structural problems, chronic noise issues, leaking pipes, broken elevators, mechanical systems that did not work the way a building of this cost and prestige was supposed to work. Residents who had paid tens of millions of dollars for apartments in the tallest residential tower in the Western Hemisphere found themselves living in a building that could not keep water out of the walls. A second lawsuit followed, alleging that the developers had been aware of certain structural limitations and had built the tower regardless. The coverage was damaging and widespread and spread well beyond the specialized real estate press into the general consciousness of a city that had watched this building go up with considerable attention. But the most personal blow to Richard Calloway arrived through his own financial decisions, as the most personal blows usually do. He had purchased several apartments at 432 Park Avenue for himself and Nicole. Units on the 78th floor, the same floor that became the reception space for their wedding celebration, the same building where their portrait had been hung. He had borrowed approximately $46 million to acquire those units, money that he owed to his development partner. And when the financial pressures of his life made it impossible for him to service those loans, he defaulted. He lost the apartments. A court order confirmed that the units had been transferred to his creditor and that Richard Calloway and Nicole were ordered to vacate. The man who had put his face on the building, who had celebrated his new marriage on the floor he had fought over in his divorce proceedings, who had announced to the whole city that he was beginning again and that this time everything was going to be different, that man was evicted from his own skyscraper. He then reportedly attempted to list the apartments for sale even after he had already lost legal ownership of them, an attempt so remarkable that major financial publications reported on it with barely concealed disbelief. He tried to sell a penthouse he no longer owned for $75 million. The deal, for obvious reasons, did not close. There is a question that people always want answered in stories like this one, and it is not the question about the money. The money is easier to understand than the other question. It has a number attached to it, a judgment, a settlement figure, a court ruling. The question people actually want answered is this: did he ever understand what he had done? Not in a legal sense, not in a financial sense, in the human sense. Did Richard Calloway, in the years that followed the divorce and the portrait and the eviction, ever arrive at a genuine reckoning with what he had thrown away and what it had cost the person he had thrown it away from? The people who covered this story most closely do not agree on the answer. Some say that Richard Calloway was, at his core, constitutionally unable to look backward in the way that kind of reckoning requires. That the same relentless forward momentum that had made him rebuild after the 2008 financial crisis also made it impossible for him to sit with the full weight of what he had done to Catherine. Others say that in the quieter moments, in conversations that are not part of any public record, there were signs that he understood more than he ever admitted out loud. The truth, as with most questions about what men like Richard Calloway feel in private, is probably somewhere between those two versions. Closer to the first than the second, but somewhere in between. While Richard was navigating the aftermath of the divorce and the complications of the life he had chosen, Catherine was doing something remarkable, and I use that word deliberately, not in the promotional sense, but in its original meaning. She was living, not performing recovery for an audience, not demonstrating resilience for the benefit of people who were watching, simply living in the plaza apartment she had fought to keep, in the city she had called home for over 50 years, maintaining the relationships and the work
It is a
and the
true joy to
cultural
see you all here
commitments
tonight,
that
gathered
mattered
in
to
this
her.
magnificent
She
hall. Your
continued her
presence
involvement
honors
with the
us.
institutions she had supported for decades. She continued to be present in the art world, though the physical collection she had built was now scattered across auction rooms and new private hands. The people close to her in those years describe a woman who had arrived at the other side of a very long fight and found that the other side was, in many unexpected ways, cleaner than what she had been living inside for years before the divorce began. She had done the hardest thing, and she was still here. There is a detail that keeps staying with me about Catherine Calloway in the years after the divorce was finalized. The people who knew her say she seemed lighter. Not lighter in the shallow sense of someone relieved of a burden they never wanted, though there may have been elements of that. Lighter in the sense of someone who had been seen, who had been recognized, whose contributions to a 57-year partnership had been examined in detail by a court of law and found to be real and significant and worthy of acknowledgement in the form of a 64-page ruling. For years, Catherine had been the background, the stable half, the one who cultivated the art and ran the social calendar and knew where every document was and remembered every detail and kept everything functioning while her husband received the recognition. And then, in a court decision, she received her own. The judge had looked at the record and found her in it, fully. Not as an appendage to Richard's story, but as a person whose work and judgment and presence had been essential to the building of everything that was now being divided. And that, not the money, though the money absolutely mattered. That was what changed something. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want you to take a moment before you answer. When Richard Calloway offered Catherine $1 billion to settle, and she said no, what was your first reaction? Because people who hear that moment in the story for the first time tend to fall into two camps. Some say she was absolutely right, that no amount of money should be accepted when the offer is designed to obscure the truth and protect the person who wronged you, that her refusal was not about greed but about dignity, and dignity is not for sale at any price. But others say, and this is the position I find more complicated and more interesting, that she was making a practical decision in a painful moment, that $1 billion is $1 billion, that there is wisdom in taking what is offered and spending the rest of your life living rather than fighting. Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know which camp you are in. And more importantly, I want to know why. Because the why is where this gets interesting. I want to end this story in the place where it is most honest, which is not in the courtroom and not in the auction house and not on the side of a skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan. I want to end it in the larger question that this story asks. The question of what it means to spend decades inside a partnership that is not equal, and what happens when that partnership ends, and what it requires of a person to look at what is being offered and say, that is not enough, because I know what this was actually worth. Because this story is not unique in its outline. The specific details, the art collection, the skyscraper, the Park Avenue apartments, the 42-foot portrait of a man who loved a picture of himself, those are unique. But the core of it, a man who benefited from a woman's intelligence and stability and social capability for decades, and then decided he could leave her for a new version of his life without real consequence. That is not unique at all. That story is told in courtrooms and attorneys' offices and kitchen tables across this country every single day, at every income level, in every kind of marriage. What makes the Calloway story worth examining in this kind of detail is not the numbers, though the numbers are astonishing. It is what the numbers represent. Every dollar in that art collection represents a decision Catherine made, a relationship she cultivated, a piece of work she recognized before the market did. Every dollar in that real estate portfolio represents a year of her stability, holding the foundation while his ambition took the risks, her presence in their shared life providing the conditions under which everything he built was possible. When Judge Drager looked at all of that and said this is jointly owned, she was not just dividing assets. She was recognizing a truth that Richard Calloway had spent years obscuring, that you cannot separate an empire from the partnership that made it possible. That the person who held everything together while you were out building was not a service provider. She was a builder. She just built things that do not get their names on skyscrapers. Richard Calloway spent 57 years with a woman who saw him clearly, who understood what he was building and what it required and what it cost, and who chose to invest the full weight of her own intelligence and capability in supporting it. He is one of the most talented real estate developers that New York has ever produced. His buildings are part of the city's skyline in ways that will outlast everyone in this story. And he threw away the partnership that made all of it possible because he confused the feeling of having arrived with the feeling of deserving something better. That confusion is expensive. In his case, it cost him tens of millions of dollars in settlement payments. One of the most significant private art collections in the country, the respect of certain portions of his professional world, and eventually the very penthouse apartments where he had staged his triumphant new beginning. It cost Catherine decades of invisibility and then years of legal fighting, and then the sale of a collection she had spent half a century building. It cost them both things that cannot be captured in a court ruling or expressed as a settlement figure. That is the story. And the question it leaves you with, the one I hope you will carry with you after this is over, is simply this. When we look at the people beside us, the people who have spent years making our lives possible and our work sustainable and our world stable, are we actually seeing them? Or are we making the same mistake Richard Calloway made? Are we looking at the foundation and calling it furniture? Thank you for spending this time with me today. These stories matter, not as entertainment, though I hope this one held your attention from the first word to the last. They matter because they are about something real, about what we owe each other in the long partnerships of our lives, about what happens when power is held unequally and the person holding less of it finally decides to stop accepting that arrangement. They matter because Catherine Calloway is not a fictional character. She is a real woman who spent 57 years doing work that went unrecognized, and then spent several more years in a courtroom fighting to have it recognized, and she won. And her story belongs in the conversation we are all having about what long marriages truly cost and who truly pays. If this story moved you, if it made you think about something in your own life or in the lives of people you love, please leave a comment. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to this channel so you do not miss the next story.